Welcome to GM Mastermind, a tabletop RPG podcast that features a panel of game masters known as the Brain Trust. In this episode, we will be discussing Session 0. Introducing the Brain Trust for the episode. Jared Rasher. GMing for over 33 years, he writes reviews for Gnome Stew and his blog, whatdoiknowjr.com, with over 800 pages of content. The games he's GM'd the most include Dungeons & Dragons, Powered by the Apocalypse Games, and Cortex. Currently, he's playing D&D 5th Edition and Star Trek Adventures. You can find his writings on gnomestew.com as well as his blog, whatdoiknowjr.com. Kimi. She's not sure how long she's been game mastering. Something like 11 to 12 years. Her go-to games to run most often are Wild Talents and Masks. Currently, she's playing D&D, Starscape, and Powered by the Apocalypse Games. She oversees Happy Jacks RPG Network at happyjacks.org, a community that produces RPG advice and actual plays of all different systems. You can find games she designs at goldenlassogames.com. Senda. Behind the screen for 10 years and current host of Pandas Talking Games, co-host of the 5-year run of She's a Super Geek, and writer at gnomestew.com. Games she's run the most include Lasers and Feelings, to include her own personal hacks, All Out of Bubblegum, and One Last Job. She actually prefers to not run the same game twice. The most recent game she's playing includes Monster Hearts 2 and Cortex Prime. Be sure to check out Turning Point and Love and Justice on Drive-Thru RPG, and the latter is also on itch.io. And I'm Sean, host of the show. Having a 15-year break from RPGs, I've been GMing on and off since 2003. Some of my favorite RPGs to GM include Delta Green, Forbidden Lands, and FFG's Star Wars. I've been gaming for a long time. Now, on to the episode. Welcome. Thanks for joining us, Jared, Kimi, and Senda. How are all of you?
Great. Excited to be here.
Hey. Very much so.
We are here to talk about Session 0. And, you know, I don't know if you've run into individuals in the gaming sphere that they either don't do Session 0 or they don't believe in Session 0, which is strange to me because I think if you say, hey, can we game on Thursday, it could be considered a Session 0, even though it's very condensed. Would you agree, Kimi?
Yeah, it can be very condensed. And I have, as you said, met people who were like philosophically against Session 0s, which just seems very strange to me. And people just think it's not necessary, but spoilers, I disagree with those people.
That's okay. So is it, this would be strange to have you on the show, but I have to ask, do each one of you do a Session 0 when you're going to kick off a game?
No, Sean, I was really surprised you called me to be on that. Yes, I do.
Absolutely not.
Do any of you know what Session 0 is? No.
I mean, that may not be a bad place to start because it's possible that people are listening to this who may not know what Session 0 is, because it is an element that is a newer kind of addition to the gaming hobby and something that's sort of starting to become a thing that is kind of across the board, but there's still people who may not know what it is.
Senda, do you want to enlighten us?
Yeah, sure.
Your
so
definition of Session 0?
My personal definition, which is going to inform probably a lot of the understanding then of what my personal Session 0s look like, right? But Session 0 is essentially the session before you actually sit down to play the game, that usually encompasses things like your discussion of maybe what you want to play or how you're going to schedule the game. Character creation is frequently involved. For me at my table, it's also a discussion of like safety and what safety mechanisms we want to use for the game, and also potentially employing those for stuff that we want to discuss before the game. Specifically, lines and veils, if you're familiar with that one, is usually a Session 0 thing for me. Yeah, I think that's I'm trying to remember what else I usually talk about during session 0, but I think that covers broadly, what we'd really be talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Did I miss anything? There's a lot of years of GMing at this table, so
I think session 0 is like it's basically all the agreements that you think are important. Like you said, you kind of went through a list of a lot of the ones that are really important. One of the things that a lot of people don't talk about is basic agreements about scheduling, which I always like to make sure that is included as well. Okay, we've got 5 people playing. How many? If 2 people can't make it, is that when we call it? So that way we have a set understanding of basic things like that too. As you said, like safety tools are super important. Discussing which ones you're going to use, and then how, like you said, how they're going to be implemented. Like when someone taps the X card, okay, what is going to be our norm for how we react to that? Does that person say something? So that way everybody knows what to do the first time it's used if they've never, used it in this particular group before, because different groups have different play culture with what to do with different safety tools as well. And then, lines and veils is absolutely a must for every session 0. And for those of you who may not know, lines and veils, like she was just talking about, is a safety tool. Basically, you agree what's going to be a line, like, okay, these are the things that will not be in our story together. So for me personally, anything that with like child harm or endangerment as kind of a new mom, like stresses me out and makes everything not fun like immediately. So that's a line for me right now. While veils are more like, like a PG movie, like fade to black, like, okay, they're getting it on, but we kind of pan away to the blowing curtains moments.
What are they getting on? What?
Yeah.
You're getting on a bike or something?
Exactly.
Lost me, Kim.
So it's in the story, but not like explicit.
One of the things that I've been, and I never used to have good session 0s, even though I tried to have them. And then I started realizing that I need to outline them the same way that I do a regular session, so that I'm saying we have to hit this, 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 and this before we leave. And one of the things that I've been adding in is going over what the tone and what type of campaign it's going to be, because even in a somewhat narrow game, sometimes people have different ideas. Like, for example, if you're playing a Star Wars game, a lot of people think that they know what you're talking about, but at the same time, I'd rather sit down and say, we're going to play Age of Rebellion, and I want it to feel like Rogue One versus Rebels. You just have that idea of what level of grittiness and how nasty things are going to get, and that type of thing, just so that everybody's expectation is in the same place.
I think you actually just said a really key word, which is expectation, right? So if we were just to encompass everything that we all just said, what we're really talking about is session 0 is how you set the expectations for the entire campaign that is to follow, right? That's really what it comes down to.
That's like the definition right there. Like in the book,
right,
you look it up.
Nice.
That was beautiful, succinct, and lovely.
We got there.
Can we agree that a session 0 increases the chances of a successful game or campaign in RPGs?
Yes,
absolutely.
100%. Yeah.
I've actually found like a lot of people have the idea, or a lot of people who aren't used to session 0s or are against them think it's because people in the game are afraid of pushing boundaries. But I've actually found that games I've run and been a part of where everyone felt safe and in control because of the use of safety tools and because of a very clear session 0 setting expectations, that we actually were able to push the envelope on those games a lot further and take a lot more chances and do more daring and out there things, because everyone felt safe in doing so, because everybody knew, okay, this is what our lines and veils are. This is what we're going to do. This is the tone of the game. We all are like right in there. So actually, it's one of the cases of having very clear boundaries lets you have a lot more fun in those boundaries.
But Kimmy, I've known my group for 20 years.
All right.
No. So here's the thing about that.
I haven't known them for 20
right?
years.
I mean, you did. That's fine. That's great. But The thing I think that we don't always talk about when that's the reaction, because I have to admit to you, my particular group does not always do an entire session 0 anymore, because we've been playing together for about 6 years now, I think, which is nothing on your 20, whatever. But it's long enough and consistent enough that there are certain expectations that we carry through game over game, right? So we don't necessarily have to talk about them again because we've already talked about them. But the key is that we did talk about them, right? So we don't have to rediscuss how we're going to use safety tools. Sometimes we talk about which ones we're going to use because in a different game, we might, like there are certain ones that are always in use, but in, a specific game, there might be an additional one or a twist on the one that we usually do or whatever. But there are assumptions that we can all now walk in with about the kind of game that we're going to play. We all know the schedule. It is regular. It always happens. We know what happens when people don't show up. We know where we're going to play. We know what happens if someone gets COVID and we have to play online, right? Like we've already solved for all this stuff. And we actually play a ton of different games. So we usually play short campaigns. And what that means is we're starting new games with some level of regularity, depending on how frequently we can get enough people to play the actual game. Monster Hearts 2, we started Halloween of last year. We're like, yeah, whatever. We'll finish it by January. And it is June. So we haven't. And that's okay. But we usually turn over new games, I would say about every 3 to 6 months. And we don't have a full session 0 like I would have with a new group every time we do that, because we have those understandings. So I think there's actually a thing where playing with people for a long period of time just means that you already have shared expectations and you don't necessarily have to go over those again if you are all confident that you are truly sharing those expectations, right? But even having said that, we always talk about, as Kimi was saying, the lines and veils, we always talk about hard lines and veils for each specific game, because while some of them, like child harm or like, sexual assault, like that kind of stuff for me, that crosses genres, it doesn't matter. But sometimes you are walking into a horror game and you have different expectations as a table about what might come up for that game versus everything else, right? So there are things that we address on a game-by-game basis and things that are kind of already addressed at the group level that we don't necessarily feel the need to talk about in detail again unless something changes. And I think that's the other key part is like, it's your opportunity to make sure that you're having the conversation in case anything has changed. But you still have to build characters and stuff, so you're still going to just sit down and have a session 0, right? It's just the shape of it might change depending on who you're sitting down with. One of the things that I also think is interesting about session 0 is I'm sort of stereotypically known as a one-shot GM because of She's a Super Geek and obsessively running games at conventions and being really fascinated by how we can create like the short form versions of role-playing games that I don't have to commit to 5 years of, every Friday night or whatever it is. And we don't always talk about session 0 in terms of shorter play, but we still do it, right? Because when you come sit down at my table at a convention and I talk you through what the game is, what the tone of the game is, how to make a character, and we talk through the safety tools, we just did like the 15, 20-minute version of a session 0, which is appropriately scaled to the time frame in which we are playing, right? So I think a lot of times we actually, even people who don't think they're doing session 0s, they are, kinda. They might not be formal, right? But there's important stuff there.
I was going to share, I have a very personal story where this didn't happen and I was the person affected. Like you were just saying, sometimes things change. And I had a first responder situation to a car accident at my place of work a couple of years ago. At the time I was an admin in a school, and we had a student and her mother who were hit by a car out in the front. And it was a really emotional day. The mother ended up passing away, and I spent the day at the hospital with the child while we were waiting for her to get in touch, trying to get the rest of her relatives there, someone to take charge of her. I was her guardian for the day, basically. And that weekend I had a game convention. It was like 4 days later. And I was so excited to go to game convention, kind of get away. Obviously, like I hadn't really processed what had happened. And I was playing in a game with like friends of mine. Like our friendship is old enough to drink. Like we've been playing games for so long. And it was one of those things where we didn't think about it and we didn't do a session 0 before a con game. And at one point there was like an NPC kid who wasn't even like the focus of the scene. And this NPC kid was like, there's a crowd and the NPC kid was like, mama, like looking for her mom. And I just like, I lost it. Like I wasn't even like the focus. I hadn't even really thought about it. And it was one of those moments, like looking back now, like if we'd done a quick session 0, I would have processed that. I hadn't even processed it enough to really talk about it with my friends and like tell them it had happened that week. So it can be so important, even at like a quick con game where you're like, oh, it's like a kind of a set story. I know what's happening. Like just touching base and being like, hey, where is everybody this week? If it's a group really well, any big things happen that we should like beware of, like while we're doing this, because sometimes players come to the table and they don't even realize they're going to be affected by something. But if you, as the GM, just kind of like, hey, any heads up on anything new, then they're like, oh, I should probably say this. So yeah, just checking in is so important, like you were just saying.
Jared, we've talked about how important it is, obviously, and the tools that come with it. And I think there's a lot of criteria that can go into a session 0. What would you say is the minimum to cover in a session 0?
Let's see. I have my bullet points of things that I want to take away by the time I'm done with session 0. So it's like, I want to know what the players don't want in a game. I want to make sure the players know what tools are available, whether that's safety tools or what we're actually going to be using as far as like supplements, things like that. I want to make sure we get character concepts nailed down. I usually am not that concerned about having hard and fast statistics for every character by the end of a session 0. I just want to know, like, if you're going to be an elf ranger, let me know you're going to be an elf ranger. That's all I'm really worried about there. And then, and just have a clear idea of what the game's going to feel like.
I have to jump in because I realized something about how I run games and the games that I've been playing a lot recently, as you stated in the intro, which is that character creation for me is like not a long process, right? Because usually there's like a playbook involved or something. So we all just sit down and you circle some things and you write down 3 numbers and like you're good. So why wouldn't you do that all together and then just build the relationships, right? But like, yeah, if you're talking about a much longer process, if you are crunching down modifiers and stuff like that and making a bunch of decisions about your feats that are going to impact you for the next however many levels, yeah, like some of that detail work is not necessarily fun to do as a group because it's just passing a book around for a long time, right? So I just realized I have this preset notion in my head of what that looks like just because of what I've been doing recently. I had to call that out because I kept saying it.
That's a good point, though. Do we think session 0 is always the same? Do we get into our own zone?
If I'm going to be running a PBTA game, I do kind of expect us to have all of our characters done by the end of that session.
Right? Because why wouldn't you?
Sure.
The Star Trek game that I'm running, even though I normally don't want to necessarily force somebody to go through a long, character creation process, we did in Star Trek because it has a life path system. And I did want to make sure that everybody was going through that life path system and getting an idea of who their character was before the campaign started. So in that case, we did take more time out and go through all of those steps.
It makes perfect sense. I think there's something to be said for, to some extent, the mechanics of the game itself that you're playing will probably have an effect on what ends up being in your session 0. Whether that's because session 0 is like wrapped up in the game because you just grabbed for the queen and you're just gonna like, play it out. And you're like literally reading the session 0 prompts off the cards as you pass it around. Or if that means that you're sitting down to something that has a much more complex rule system that you're like, cool, we want to make sure we understand how we're all going to be interconnected, but like go figure out the deets on your own kind of situation. Like that kind of stuff is going to have an effect, and it makes sense that it would, as long as it means that you've had the time to communicate. And again, set the expectations. that word is a good word. Expectations.
Are there games, you mentioned one that I'm not wholly familiar with, but are there games with like built-in session zeros?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say there are. Now I'm trying to think of more. Kimmy, did you have one? Because I saw you start.
I mean, shameless self-promotion, but the game I'm writing right now, Starscape, actually has it built in as part of it's obviously Starscape. It's a sci-fi space game. You start off by picking what kind of story you're going to tell, whether it's space opera or space western or utopian exploration or whatever. You build what kind of crew, and part of it is okay, if this was a movie, what would it be rated? So that's one of the questions that is actually built into the story as you go too. So everyone has that expectation. And I think that's really important. And I have seen similar questions to that. They haven't quite been as explicitly stated in other systems. You mentioned For the Queen, it does have those in there. A couple different PBTA games have similar things in there where it sets the expectations for what it's going to be. A lot of them simply tell you. They don't give you like the options to pick. So if you're playing like Apocalypse World or something like that, it's like, this is the type of game this is, and so a lot of times it's there. Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you want this game, it's this. I know that iHunt is very specific about that. It's like, this is the type of game it is. Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
I'm feeling really silly right now because you said I'm writing a game right now, and I said to myself, I wrote a game like that.
Wait, Senda, isn't there a game that you might have been involved with?
Senda found a game that has a session zero that apparently.
Well, no, actually what I was going to say is we haven't finished writing the entire book, right? But the quick start version of Turning Point that is on drive-thru right now, it's a quick start of the rules, but it is also literally a script that you can, you could sit down and read from it at the table, and it walks you through everything through what I would consider the session zero, right, setup of the game, which includes all the character parts and the safety stuff, and all of the investment in the game and level setting. So that's all kind of in the script of the quick start and then getting to the game. And we wrote it in there for a reason, right? Because it's important and because Turning Point has the potential to be a very emotional game depending on how you play it. So it's super important that everybody is like, A, on the same page, B, understands the lines and veils in the situation, C, understands how to back away from a situation that they discover, because the X card or another tool along those lines is an during play way to revoke consent versus a way to set boundaries initially. So some form of consent revoking tool. I think that when you are, I'm going to put on the designer hat for a second and see if Kimmy agrees with me. When you are writing a game that is trying to create a very specific style of play, then it's worth it to write in how you kind of get there, right? And some of that is about guiding what a session zero would look like to make sure that people have the conversations that you as the designer think are important to achieve that purpose.
I think that is right on, and especially looking at games as a designer too. If you kind of look at the progression, it's really telling about how much a good session zero can improve play, because we've gone from a place where no books mentioned it, and some people were kind of doing it on their own, to a place where almost universally, even the big books kind of mention session zero, or at least pre-game agreements is another thing they kind of officially call them in D&D and a couple of the other books. To now we've moved on even from just mentioning session zero to it actually being written into the games themselves. So there's been this progression over the last 10 years that just shows designers even are realizing how much better their game can play if it has set expectations like that. So it's becoming more and more a vital component of games rather than something you can kind of do or not.
I think it's I was running an experiment to find out for every failure of a game why, and then was it covered in session zero? And if it was, okay, sometimes it happens, right? Yep, I'm on board. Game hits the table. Wait a minute, hold on a second. But you said you were on board, so it falls apart regardless. But there's so many of those instances that comes up. I put it out to a poll, some of the listeners of the show, and what they want to include in a session 0, or think that's important in a session 0. And we mentioned safety tools, expectations that covers like umbrella, right? But some of the nuances obviously is going to be dependent on the game you're playing, which has been brought up. Has anybody used the CATS method?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You want to explain that?
I
Senda?
haven't actually run a game where I've used the CATS method. I just tend to play with people who use CATS. So now you're going to put me on the spot to try and remember what it means.
We could get Jared. Do you know what it is?
No, not offhand.
Okay.
I didn't study for this podcast.
Concept. I'll give you
Concept. There we go. Yeah. And then A stands for something else.
Aim.
There we go. The T stands for tone. I remember that. And the S stands for another thing.
Subject matter.
Yeah. Look at that. See? I remembered 1 out of 4. I'm feeling good about my night.
Hey, that's okay. But CATS is a good one. And so talking about some of the resources of, obviously listen to the show and the podcast and everybody else's respected blog or actual plays or podcasts. But what other resources are out there to give you more details on session 0? Do you have any ones that you've got in your back pocket that tend to, because some of us, we have our own, of course, and I'll put one out there, the Gauntlet. If you've ever been to their resources page, the Gauntlet Network, they do a lot of actual plays and they do a lot of community play involvement. Senda's nodding her head, very familiar. But their lines and veils, have you seen the list that they have?
Not recently.
It
was long the last time I saw it, though.
Yeah. Well, and I was, I think we know, like, here's the standard 5, that I'll always hit. And then I read that list and go, yeah, okay, right. Didn't think about alcoholism or, things of that nature that could be, tricky for some arachnophobia, things of that nature. But that's where I found, and I think, I've got some contacts of mine that had turned me on to CATS, and that's where it's used too. Some mention the kind of game, the allowable characters, serious or pretzel and beer game. So that comes into the tone, I think. Differences from the standard game, which I think, Senda, you mentioned, right? The different, like the rule set, or maybe it might have been Kimi.
No, I think it might have been Jared.
Might have been Jared.
Let's give Jared some credit here.
Maybe Jared. Jared, you said that, didn't you?
He was talking about the splat books.
That's but that's the home rules, right? The house rules for even some of those older school games that are like, here's like bare bones, and then, oh, by the way, here's all the tweaks that I've made. And then the duration, like how long is a session? How long is the game? Mm-hmm. And then what do you do if a GM can't make it? Do you include that in the session 0? What's often missed, Jared?
Length of campaign.
Think that's the number 1 that's missed?
I think so.
Why?
And that one, I would like to throw that one out to Phil, because that was in Never Unprepared that I first read that as something that you should be thinking about. And ever since I read that in there, it's like, yeah, we should really go over how long we expect this game to last.
He's talking about Phil Vecchione from Misdirected Mark and, I don't know, Panda's Talking Games.
Panda's Talking Games, that one, yeah.
and noted definer of words.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's the big one, duration, huh?
I honestly, I think so.
Because none of us know when it's going to end. We don't know.
Never.
And that's that thing. Like when, not to assume something here, Sean, but like when we were younger, this thought process is we're going to run this campaign forever.
Forever.
And no, we're not.
I don't know what you're talking about. I totally did not ever finish that 3-year campaign that I played in college. Like that definitely did not come to an end.
Or it comes to an end abruptly, right? Like,
it came to an unsatisfying end because it was Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil and we didn't finish it.
So you're saying you didn't return?
Well, we returned. But then there was like, college social stuff and it imploded. But sad. But if we had said we're going to play this for 6 months, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I can't say that college social stuff still wouldn't have imploded the game, right? Like, that's a weird time of your life, right? Things are going to happen. But, I think it's more important as an adult and a parent now. It is difficult for me to say to you, I will commit every Monday night of my life for an indeterminate amount of time that requires, a certain amount of finagling and like making sure that children are fed and blah, 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 right? Like it takes
not
work.
Hitting up Senda for my next game, obviously.
Well, it takes work, right? But if you tell me I want this campaign to be 8 sessions and we're going to play for a couple hours at a time, that is something that I can, with that informed consent, say, yes, that this is a thing that I can do, or no, this is not going to work with my life. And then you don't get to like, oh my gosh, we're 8 sessions in and like, I cannot manage this time frame, can't get home fast enough, like whatever it is. And then like someone drops out because they couldn't manage the scheduling, right? So I actually think the more weird and wild your life gets, the more important it is that people are really clear and upfront with the timing expectations and like approximate length of campaign, because it's just a really different prospect to say, yeah, I'm on for this for 2 months versus like, I'm on for this for the next 5 years. Goodbye vacations because I can never leave because I can't be out of town for a week or whatever, Not that you would commit to that level, hopefully, but,
Kimi, have you ever brought up Session 0 up again for the same game?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I actually am a big fan of debriefs at the end of each game. And I think that should definitely be part of something you agree on in Session 0, whether you use, like some people do, like Roses and Thorns, where you're like, okay, these are good things and things I don't. I prefer Stars and Wishes. It's got a very fluffy name. But basically, as a GM, too, it's a fantastic tool to like guide you in what you should do in the next session, in addition to letting the players be heard. So basically, like Stars are like, oh, hey, these are the moments I really loved. And Wishes, it's like, oh, I really wish maybe we could do more of this. And as a GM, that's like gold right there. In addition to like making there be crystal clear communication at the table, you're like, they want to do more of this. Okay, well, that's where half my planning for the next session is done. I no longer have to stress out about my planning because I know they're already wanting to do this. So it's just
fight. We just want to fight. Okay.
And that might be it. Totally. And that could be it. And and it just like chef's kiss, like it's just a fantastic tool that you can agree on in Session 0, like the format of how you're going to debrief at the end of each session. And it's like a nice little cap at the end of each gaming session. You're like, okay, and now we know we're all done and we're moving on to the next thing.
I actually love Stars and Wishes. I used to use Roses and Thorns. The thing about Roses and Thorns is it's a little bit more like, here's this amazing thing and here's this stabby thing that I didn't like. And Stars and Wishes are a lot more like, here's a thing that I like and here's a thing I would be excited if you gave me more of. And in terms of feedback as a GM, I just love it. So if you haven't heard about Stars and Wishes, I love that it's fluffier because I think that it's like friendlier feedback. That's just a total side note.
So I had an instance where I actually did 2 Session 0s for the same campaign because we got together, we started talking about the campaign. I said, is everybody on board with this? Is this what we really want to do? And like 4 out of 5 people were on board with it. And one person, especially towards the end, started asking a whole lot of questions. And no, I'm fine. I'll play whatever anybody else wants to do. So I was like, no, we're going to do this again. We're going to start over. And I want you to be honest, because if you're not enthusiastic about this, I don't want 4/5 of the people being excited and one person just, not.
Yeah. And as a GM, like having that sense of like, okay, this person feels like they're being drug along. you know, by their like nose hairs, like they're not going to enjoy this, is really important, because so often at a table there is kind of someone who doesn't want to cause a fuss and doesn't want, or someone who's new at the table and just is like, oh, whatever the rest of you want to do, I'm good with that. And as a GM, you have to make sure that they're being heard and that they are empowered to do that. Whether you're like, a lot of my pre-game session 0 stuff, like Lines and Veils, for example, I do it on an online forum in Google Docs. So I can send an anonymous link to everybody. So everybody fills out what they want, and nobody has to feel like, oh, everyone's going to see my name next to this and wonder why that's aligned. So it's all anonymous, and everyone can just feel totally free to just be their true self and really put down what they don't want to have in their game. And some of that can be done like that, but that you've just, as a GM, like all you listening out there, have that same sense, like in the story he just told, and like just like sense, okay, this person's not really contributing, they're just like kind of agreeing, and and like really like make sure that they're actually okay with it, not just not wanting to cause a fuss.
And that brings up a good point, and you kind of touched on it, Kimi. Is it important to do session 0 face-to-face, or can you do it virtually and have the same effect either way? I
mean, some of us have no choice. A lot of us are only gaming virtually now. Mm-hmm. I think there are elements that can be done virtually. I prefer to do it in person. I try and do as much of my gaming in person as possible. It's easier to read somebody that way. It's like, okay, are they like zoned out reading something else in Zoom? Like, are they just bored and like reading Wikipedia? Or are they like uncomfortable and just trying to like decide? Like, it's hard to tell sometimes when you're online gaming. So I prefer to do session 0 in person if I can, with elements like what I was just saying that are sent ahead of time. So I'll usually send a Lines and Veils document like before session 0, so that it's all filled out when we come into session 0, so I can kind of discuss it and make clear with everyone, like, okay, these are the lines, these are the veils. Sometimes I'll keep it open, so if people like after session 0 want to add more things to that, and that's actually one of the things I go over every session is, hey, Lines and Veils are the same, or, oh, hey, this week Lines and Veils, this has been added, like no cat throw up or whatever it is. And totally very specific example, sorry. And so because it can switch and change as a campaign goes. So combination is generally what I do if you can do it in person. But again, like a lot of us have moved completely to online gaming now. So it's kind of a new thing. So just make sure that you're being able to read people, at least visually, whatever medium you're using.
And that Stars and Wishes is interesting, because I don't know if all of you do this. I'm in a couple games, and we've kind of done it, in a debrief, obviously, like Kimi mentioned earlier, where we just say, okay, hey, go to Discord, let me know your Stars and Wishes. Sure, no problem. But if you read where it's originated, which is derived from Roses and Thorns, like Senda mentioned, you're supposed to do it like right after the game, everybody face to face, and it goes in a particular order, right?
Yeah.
Are you guys on one side of the fence or the other with Stars and Wishes in that regard?
It's interesting. Really how I use it when I actually engage it is a semi-formalized way to make sure that I'm getting feedback. Because I think that a lot of times when you say, hey guys, what did you think? Did you have fun? Right? You'll just get, yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
And so doing something like Stars and Wishes, or however, I mean, it is one tool for formalizing a way to get feedback that is going to be a little bit more informational. That's the word that's trying to come out of me, than just, yeah, it was great, I loved it. Or, yeah, it was a pretty good session, right? Like those things as a GM aren't enough to necessarily guide you really well down a path. But having a structure, so this is funny because we started with session 0 really, but we keep starting to traipse off into like other tools that I then really want to talk about. Like we could get into such a conversation about safety tools and how safety tools should be updated ongoing and all of this stuff, right? But I'm like, okay, no, session 0. But I think if you will allow me to like just rope it all together,
Please.
again, because stars and wishes I like for formalizing feedback in the same way that session 0 formalizes the conversation that we have to have before we start playing, right? And so, and then gives us the tools in the session 0 to say, and here's how we will formalize the other things we want to see during the game, like feedback, or like how safety works, or even like if someone's not there. It's a way to have the discussion and say, these are the expectations, but we're formalizing how this works. And sometimes that can even be things that are like, everybody comes in, we're all eating dinner or whatever, and we're like messing around, like, how do you formalize the start of a game? Because that could be something you could talk about in session 0 too, if that's a thing that you want to formalize. Or like you've played with this group for forever and like they like to get really chatty over dinner, and then you're like, oh man, we only have an hour left to play now or something, right? Like you could say, we start this game at 7, or we start this game, as in my game, it's you're not late unless you get there after a certain person who's always the latest one. He has the farthest to drive and the job that is most likely to go long. As long as you make it here before Brett, you're on time. And that is like a tongue-in-cheek thing, but there's also a formalization, right? That like, if we know Brett's coming, we're not going to start playing till he walks in the door. When he walks in the door, we are now on the countdown to like just get everything ready and actually start playing. Mm-hmm. And it's not a specific time. And it's something that evolved. So it's not something we talked about in session 0, but boy, it's something we could have and maybe should have talked about in session 0. But it is now an expectation for my group. And it would be weird if it changed.
We haven't used the 2 words social contract.
Somehow I have been talking about social contracts a bunch without actually saying the word social contract. We can say social contract. We can say table culture. We can start saying all of these like
fair.
There's a bunch of sort of words that we tend to throw around for this stuff. Yeah. I don't know if they actually help anyone further understand or define what we're actually talking about, which is, I think, why I haven't actually used them, because in the same way that this happens very frequently, I think a lot of the times when someone says social contract or table culture, we all have an individualized understanding of what that means. And depending on which kind of games and which kind of game circles you move in, that's probably reasonably standardized across like little sets of people. But if we start talking across like gamers as a whole, I think that our definitions for that kind of thing can vary pretty widely. So if we want to start talking about them, we have to start saying like, this is exactly what I mean, right? When I say this. Anyway, that is another rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You should just start taking notes for future topics.
I think so. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm just going to call you, Senda, and just say, hey, I'm kind of dry here. Can you just kind of start throwing out a few things, like what you're thinking, and so I can write them down? Right. I don't think that would be a bad take.
Anyway, so yeah, but it is a social contract.
Well, and I think in going off of what you're saying, we, how do I put this? There are folks that I play with that they're not plugged in as much as some of us. And I say plugged in as, they don't get online. They're the home group. They show up weekly. They're going to play the game. Most of us have maybe been with each other for quite some time. They're not interested in the authors or the designer scene or a lot of this. So when you talk about that, having a session 0, which is interesting, maybe you don't even say that that's what that is, right? Or what's a social contract? Like this, we're going to talk about these things because it makes up the social contract, but I don't need to get into that. Friends of mine might look at me cross-eyed and say, what in the hell are you talking about? What? I'm not signing anything you're putting down.
Yeah.
Like, no.
Yeah, because then they will people will sometimes, especially if you've been playing for a while, people can be like, why are you formalizing this? Like all of a sudden, like, why did this get all like office? Like, why am I at work and we have specific lanes now instead of like, just chilling. I just want to chill and relax.
I think the terminology, though, sometimes it's helpful to have the terminology evolve for people, like probably most of us here, so that we know what we want to go look at and read more about when we want to learn more about how social culture or social contracts intersect with gaming. But that, like you said, that's not necessarily the people that it will affect. It's a certain subsection of people that really want to dig into things. And, it helps to have that keyword to zero in on what you want to read about or consume as far as that. And by the way, if you want to look at articles on social contracts, you should go to Gnome Stew, because I'm pretty sure you can find a few right there that discuss the topic.
Maybe just a couple.
With you two on here and Angela having been on the first one, there's going to be plenty of Gnome Stew to go around, let me tell you.
I was going to bring up one other thing, though, that I like to do and in Session Zero, which I didn't used to do, but it has worked out so well for me that I like doing it now, and that is having each player come up with a person in the setting that they know as a contact, that's a friend or family member or something like that, and then having a place that they like to go to in the setting, because that immediately kind of gives me something to latch on to them with. I don't know if somebody's going to read a book on Waterdeep and just love the Yawning Portal, but if they tell me that they like this halfling family-owned diner that they came up with, I'm going to use that, and that's going to click with them.
Yeah, you're going to get some buy-in, right away, some investment. Kimi, have you tried anything special outside of, and maybe it's pertaining to a specific game that might be falling in Session Zero? That's something like Jared mentioned.
I designed a game that does that exact thing. I was going to be good and not.
Answer.
I was not going to pitch it. I was going to be.
Run with it, Kimi. Run.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
I'm not paying Kimi, so this is her opportunity to.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm like, Thomas, shameless self-promotion is allowed. Okay. I actually think it's very important. So I actually designed a whole game based on that. It's called Decima, and it's meant to be played at a Session Zero, or at least pre-game. You come to the game with your characters formed. It can work with pretty much any session. And it does that exact thing that he was just talking about, where you find the connections between the players. So there's no more, you meet in a tavern. You have like backstory with each other, and then also with the world. So your community, your play group has like a reputation and enemies and rivals and allies that you come up with together. And then you also have like location details that you build out, like NPCs and things like that. And it works if you're using something like Waterdeep, it totally works fine with that. If you're making something whole cloth, completely homebrewed, it works with that too. And I came up with that by mixing. Me and a bunch of my friends, before we were playing games, were pulling cards from A Quiet Year, pulling connection questions from a couple of our favorite PBTAs, pulling some other questions from another place. And it was just like this wild mishmash of all these things. And I was like, all right, one of us just needs to design a game that does all this so we don't have to make all these copies every time we start a new campaign. Because we loved all those things. And it does totally create buy-in, but the biggest thing is it actually saves time in that campaign, because it makes it crystal clear what the tone is. So like even more so than like my favorite method when I'm doing like convention games is like, okay, let's agree on a TV show or a movie, because that right there, like everybody, as long as you make sure everybody's old enough to know the TV show, I know. And then, but like actually world building together really like sets the tone, and everyone knows everything in that world, and they kind of know the tone of the NPCs, and it saves time because you don't have to like then explain like, okay, you're walking down the street and there's a tavern on the left. They're like, oh, I know there's a tavern on the left because they made up the tavern. But I think that's, as far as Session Zero, the most important piece there is world building together. Make sure you're all fully bought into the world, the tone, and like we were saying, the whole cat's agreements. If somebody's like, there's a torture chamber to the left, you're like, no. And everyone has a chance to kind of like X that out or agree, like, or change it slightly. So when you start the campaign, if you've done that world building piece together in your Session Zero, like it's just crystal clear. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen.
Now, is that genre agnostic?
It is. And even the cards, like I'm going to be shameless again. They're based on like shadow art so that they can be, so they are very system agnostic. So you can, I've used it for Session Zero for a horror carnival set in the 1920s. I've used it for sci-fi games, fantasy games, obviously. Wild West games, I think, is the one that we did together, right?
Yeah, it was Wild West urban fantasy. I think we had a vampire and a werewolf.
Yes, we did.
In the Wild West.
Nobody listening
great.
is going to be able to see this, but
No. They're pretty.
But they're beautiful. And Jared
They
was
are.
prepared and had his on hand, and mine are across the room. So, if that says anything, I played it and then immediately also backed it, right?
I appreciate that. GoldenLassoGames.com.
Yeah.
We will have links to everybody. So for sure, absolutely. Now we're getting into like the tools, like actual physical tools, things that cards. Senda, have you used anything other than like the outline and some of the expectation pieces? But have you used like a tool specifically for Session Zero?
I've used Decima, obviously.
Sure.
And I'm like, let me back up. If we're talking about tools like that, I've used Decima, and I'm also very confident there's been more. I actually have used, I didn't run this game personally, but we used Microscope to set up a game actually to bridge between a Tales from the Loop game and a Things from the Flood game to jump forward the 10 years to figure out what happened between those things. We used Microscope. It was, chef's kiss. We used The Quiet Year to accidentally do a Session Zero for a shortened game of Fall of Magic. That was really cool and accidental. The Quiet Year, I feel like, is a really cool way to set up settings. I realized that everything that I've mentioned besides Decima was never really meant to be a Session Zero. It is, in fact, games on its own. But because they create these artifacts of things like timelines and maps, they're really cool to springboard off of as a Session Zero tool and make some of that stuff fun.
Can you explain A Quiet Year for those that have never heard of it, and then Microscope briefly?
Sure. So A Quiet Year is a game that is currently being distributed by Deernicorn. And it comes in this, I don't know why I'm describing the physicality of it, except that it's so cool, right? It comes in this tiny little burlap sack, and it's like a deck of cards and some skulls. And it's essentially a map making game where you draw cards to like build a community or a society and then like see what happens. And like something is gonna go wrong. And depending on who's at your table, it can go really wild. The last game I played, I think we had a quiet little sort of medieval-esque sheep shearing village and then discovered the crashed spaceship. So that was cool. And at the end of the game, basically you end up with an artifact, which is the map that you drew. Because for everything that happens, there is something on the map that represents that thing, right? So that's kind of the idea behind A Quiet Year. And the reason it can be used to lead into a game is because you end up with this really well-formed sort of idea of a place and the people who live or lived there. And you have a map of that location, right? Like, cool. Microscope is a game in which you basically create a timeline of events. And we used a really sort of, some of the rules were just sort of broken down version because we knew we were leading from specific thing to specific thing, right? But essentially, Microscope, the idea is that you have a start point, and I think do you have an end point when you start it? I can't remember. You're figuring out what happens along the way. You're literally just putting down like index cards that have events on them. Yeah, so like that's cool too, especially if you need to bridge. Say, like we did, you stopped playing this campaign about a year ago. Now you're going to start up a new version of it over here. And you're like, wow, what happened to these kids for 10 years? As we get to the, 90s instead of the 80s, what happened? I don't know. Let's find out. We know the end point here. We know the start point of the game over here. And we know, specific events that happened maybe in the middle. And then we start lining up the more personal stuff that happened to our characters in that timeline. And that was a really cool way to create the connection, to even add someone new to the group in that particular scenario so that he started building investment. The rest of us were super involved. We loved this game. I wrote about it on Gnome Stew so much. Like, If you look at any of my Gnome Stew articles, there's a specific period of time where they were all about this Tales from the Loop game. But so it was reminding those of us who had played before and rebuilding investment, and then building investment and connecting in the new player who didn't have that previous experience and previous childhood trauma that our characters had already experienced, and being like, how do we tie him into the game and make him care as much as we do, right? So it worked out really well in that scenario. I would call that almost a session 0.5 because it was a session 0 that was a bridge gap between, I don't know, it would be cool to have a different name for it. It was definitely functionally a session 0. But
I've considered using Kingdom, which is another Ben Robbins game.
I don't know that one.
I wrote a review of that on Gnome Stew. You could find that review if you...
I feel guilty now that I haven't read it, Jared. I'm sorry. I'm a terrible gnome.
Yeah. So Ben Robbins has done Microscope as well as Kingdom, and Kingdom is a kingdom building game, kind of a collaborative game group gets together and puts the world together, essentially. And it is its own game, and it goes on from there. Kimmy's nodding her head. Have you played, Kimmy? Have you played Kingdom?
I have not, but I did watch some. I don't know where I found an actual play of it, but I watched it in my tons of research about world building games like that. That was one of the things. I have not gotten a chance to play it though.
Yeah, I was going to run it for Mothership, actually, and it fell kind of apart, and then. That was the first edition, and then second edition Ben has put out there, and I haven't looked at that too in depth yet, but I think it's an interesting take, and I think could be pretty good in world building. And there's probably tons more. There's backstory cards. I don't know if anybody's used that. That's a good one. I know my buddy.
Before I got my Decima deck, I did use backstory cards for my 7th Sea game to build up some of the connections and NPCs in that game.
Nice.
I'm going to jump in and mention one more game, and I don't think that it's a specific Session 0 tool, but I just played again recently the second edition of Fiasco, and I have to say that if you're ever want to experience what a well thought through but also compressed Session 0 looks like, following through on those cards and the things that they thought about, that the back of the cards have names on them and that you just flip them over oh, now I have a name, right? Is a really fantastic experience and one that I would highly recommend.
I just wanted to drop a couple awesome tools for Session 0 that people, if they're listening, can search up unless somebody else wanted to do that. One thing that I just really love, Monte Cook Games. If you just Google Monte Cook Games Consent and Gaming, they have free resources there that you can download. One of them is a fillable Lines and Veils PDF, which is great. You can just drop that online, and then people can just go through and mark in there and check off the boxes. So it tells what the things they're very comfortable with, things that they kind of want to be you can be alluded to but not explicit about, and things that definitely won't be included in the game. And it's just a super clear way of doing it. And it lists a lot of great things that people may not think of right off the top of their head. There's also another one that's a Google form version. If you Google campaign safety and consent checklist, it's actually specific for Raimo the Frost Maiden, but it shows you if you can make a copy of it. There's not a good URL for it. It's just one that has been passed around through the lore of the internet and gamers. But you can go find that one if you Google it. It's the top thing on Googling, and you can make a copy of it and customize it for your campaign. And that's a really cool way of doing it because as on the GM, you get kind of the back end of things. And then the other thing is the TTRPG safety toolkit, which is bit.ly/TTRPG safety toolkit. And that just has a whole Google Drive folder of different resources of safety tools and different things you can use for your Session 0. It's all available for free. And one of the coolest things about that is it's all credited. So all the people who invented those specific safety tools are all listed in that folder, so you know exactly who is making your game safer.
So that's a fantastic list. I'm glad you included that. Thank you. Jared, any advice for anybody that's running a Session 0 that you've either encountered and stumbled upon, or think it's really important that they tackle that they may not be thinking about?
I honestly, I think listening to people have their best practices is great, but also, like I said, way back at the beginning, write out an outline just like you would a regular game session, just so that you don't. It's really easy to forget. Oh man, I wanted to ask them about, about this thing or that thing, or I wanted to nail down this. And if you have that outline, you can go line by line and make sure that you have all that information. And on top of that outline, have your bullet points of what you absolutely need by the time you leave. Like, if you absolutely want to know what people are playing, what time you're going to be playing, how often you're going to be playing, just make those bullet points and know I have to have this information before we finish this session.
Kimi, I'll go to you next.
I would say just as a GM, go into it with an open mind. A lot of times we go into a campaign that we've been like prepping and thinking about with a set idea. And sometimes in session 0, it can be revealed that your players are not as interested in that. Or maybe one of the big monsters you were going to have is an eel monster, and eels are on their lions list. So just, be ready to be malleable a little bit. And don't, if they X something or if they don't want to go in the direction you were going, be ready to change. And don't take that as like an affront or like a personal criticism. Just like, okay, cool. We're going to tell a different story than I had planned, and that's cool.
I think the thing that I will say is that even when you've been playing with the same people for a really long time, it's still worth it to have some kind of discussion before you start playing. And I think that's a place that it's easy to, be like, yeah, we don't need to talk about this. We play all the time. But that check-in in that moment to make sure nothing has changed and to see what people want to see out of that particular game you're about to play.
All great stuff. Thank you so much for everyone being here. I appreciate it. Well, we will have links to each one of the resources, to each one of these individuals, and where you can find them online in the show notes. So by all means, reach out to them if they're on Twitter and follow them, or go to Gnome Stew and read all their great articles, or watch their live plays and actual plays and listen to their podcasts. Can't thank you enough. Thank you very much. So this has been another episode of Game Master Mastermind. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, be a positive force in the tabletop RPG hobby. This episode of GM Mastermind, produced with help from the following members of the Mind: Eric Salzwedel, Yorkus Rex, John Mahoney, Larry Hout, Craig Shipman, Old School DM, Ghost GM, Ron Bishop, Wayne Peacock, Aaron Relia, Matthew Helsby, Laramie Wall, Farty McButterpants, Harrigan, Hoos Carl, Larry Hollis, Polish Ogre, Tony Sugarloaf Baker, Mirko Froelich, Zagrave, and Joe Swick. Thanks for your continued support. I appreciate it. Since we're just starting out, do me a favor. Let somebody know about the podcast. Have them subscribe. It goes a long ways. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one.